Let's get into today's lesson. I really like the idea of a memoir, I think, as a first book. So a lot of people are scared of writing a memoir because they think that their life is not that interesting or something hasn't happened to them that's important or they haven't accomplished their dream. And there's a little bit of a problem with humility. Does anyone feel that? Where you think nothing's really happened in my life that's worthy of writing a book about myself. I definitely struggle with that a little bit in the beginning. But the point of a memoir, and this is really important, the difference between an autobiography and a memoir is essentially scope and intent. So whenever you're thinking, I don't know if it's worthy, if my life is worthy of a memoir, you're often misguided in the sense that you think you're writing an autobiography. An autobiography is essentially almost every major event in your life. So you guys have probably read some of Elon Musk or Benjamin Franklin or Steve Jobs. Or the idea is that you're literally writing every single thing that happened. It's the history of World War II, the history of this person's life. And it'll start usually with where were they born and what were their family like and what was happening in the world at the time that they were born. And then the last chapter will be when they die. And this story is really simple in that sense. It's just what happened. A memoir is not that. This is very important to understand. A memoir is not that. A memoir starts with a lesson that was caused by an event. It's usually one event, and then you reverse engineer the entire book from that event. And so you can write a memoir that is one day in your life. The memoir could be a week, it could be a month, it could be 1 year, it could be over the course of 3 years and things that happened over the course of those 3 years, which culminated and climaxed with the big event that you learned something. This is a really important detail to understand the difference between a memoir and an autobiography. So when you feel this resistance to writing a memoir, it's often because you think that you're writing an autobiography. I'm going to write my autobiography. That is a little extreme unless you've lived a great life. You can do that for maybe your family, but autobiographies are usually for people that accomplish something in a grand scale. But memoirs, on the other hand, are not. So the scope of a memoir is much smaller, and the intent of a memoir is not for you to explain your entire life. Your intent is to teach some lesson. This is also the difference between a biography book and a history book. So, for example, a history book are often written like novels, and they're adventurous, and they dig into a particular story within something that happened in history. But it's not an academic book. It's usually one character or one thing or one event or one perspective, and they're essentially written like novels. Whereas a biography, again, just like an autobiography, is going to be written more academically, and it's going to tell you from beginning to end. I know I'm harping on this, but it's really important that you understand this concept. So we all know, hopefully, that there's 7 stages to writing a book. I repeat this over and over and over again because this is important. Can you write more than one memoir? Absolutely. This is a really smart question. You absolutely can write more than one memoir. Why? Because you can share more than one lesson in your life. Whereas you can't write more than one autobiography because you already wrote the entire scope of everything that happened. So there are many, many, many authors. Probably the most famous one right now is Donald Miller. You guys know Donald Miller? So he's switched to business books, which is really interesting. But Blue Like Jazz was the book that threw him into the zeitgeist. And this is a memoir. And then Scary Close is a memoir. And then A Million Miles in 1,000 Years is a memoir. So his first 3 books were memoirs. So he wrote 3 books to open his career. So yeah, very doable. Because you have 3 different lessons, 3 different things that happened in your life. You could have a memoir from your childhood. You could have a memoir from high school. You could have a memoir from your college years. You could have a memoir from your early business years. You could have a memoir from something that happened in a divorce. You could have a memoir about a trauma. Essentially, what is the climax? I'll get into this. And then you reverse engineer the story from that climax. How do you determine what is the big idea from one's life? The question that you're asking has too high of stakes. So I'll give you a way of framing writing that I think will help. Whenever I have a lot of copywriters in my companies, and there's content writers and then there's copywriters. And the difference between a content writer and a content writer is writing something like an essay or a story or social media post or blog or some content, right? Teaching, whereas a copywriting is writing something that essentially is for sales. It's driving an action. So when you see a billboard, that's copywriting, whereas if you read a blog, that's content writing. And the reason why I say this is that whenever they are struggling to come up with a headline for a website or a subject line for an email or even the content for an email, this is how I break their brain a little bit. I tell them to write 5 versions in the next 5 minutes. So think about that. People think that when there's conflict, whether it's emotional or physical, there's fight or flight. But most often, a lot of people do neither. They freeze, which is also a tactic. Fight, flight, or freeze. And so, for example, in the wild, there's certain animals that will freeze and then they hope, don't see me. Or this happens in horror movies, right? Someone's hiding and they'll just stay quiet, don't move. That's a tactic for survival. So this is in us naturally. It's in our DNA to freeze. And so the problem is that you're putting too high of stakes on the idea being the perfect idea. So when I say, oh, you need to write a headline, oh, I'm not really sure. What's the big idea for my life? It's too complex. I don't know. That's okay. Choose 10. Choose 10 in the next 5 minutes. This is called the Pomodoro technique, where you set a timer. I have to come up with 10 big ideas for memoir ideas, 10 lessons from my life. And I have to write them down in the next 5 minutes or something bad is going to happen to someone I love. I know that that's extreme, but could you write down 10 ideas? Yeah. All of a sudden, the mom can pick up the car. You increase the stakes and you're able to do something. And so whenever you're at a crossroads or a block, writer's block, all that's happening is that you are putting too high of stakes on the output. You are essentially being insecure about having the perfect version. And there is no such thing as a perfect version. All you can do is just move to the next step. And then once you have the thing finished, then you can judge it, then you can edit it, then you can mold the clay. But in the beginning, you just need the clay. And so instead of thinking, what is the big idea? Think, what are the 10 big ideas that could be the book? And then, all right, take a break, have a cup of coffee, go on a walk, and then an hour later, come back and instead of these 10, what are the top 3? I have to write it gun to the head. You have to choose in the next 30 seconds. What are the top 3? What's your instinct? There's a book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. If you guys have seen this, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And the science behind this book essentially is saying that once you have mastered something, which you all have mastered your life, because that's the thing that you know best, your first instincts are 90 to 95% chance correct. Your gut instinct is usually correct. Now, my gut instinct for writing a song, let's say, is probably very much not correct because I don't know anything about music and I don't know how to write songs and have no mastery in it. So if I'm not fluent in something, then don't trust your instincts because your instincts are probably incorrect. If you are a master of something and you have great experience in something, then you should trust your instincts and you should just go for it. So you are a master of your life lessons. You are a master of the things that have happened to you. You are a master of the beliefs that you have, the 5 values for how you should live a good life, better than anyone else. And so you have to just make a call. So you're incorrectly stopping yourself from getting to the first draft because you could, especially with these types of tools, you can have 5 memoirs and you could have 5 memoirs if you are used this correctly. You could have 5 first drafts in the next 5 days. I know that sounds extreme, but you literally could. And so then you can look at it, look at the clay, and then make a call. Okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to edit this one. And this is going to be the one that I'm going to do, right? So I know that was a really long tangent, but it's funny because the actual execution of the task is not that difficult. Think about it. For $1 million, you have to sit in your chair and use an AI that you already have, and you have to write the next 3 chapters in the next hour. Could you do it for $1 million? Could you do it? All of a sudden, yeah, of course I could do it. Okay, so it's not technically difficult, right? So this is why the mindset part is the real problem most of the time. The mindset problem is usually is the problem. There's something that you're feeling insecure about getting a final product because now there's judgment. I know this is intense psychology here, but that's the truth, guys. Usually when we don't do something, it's because we are worried that now that we have something final, because when it lives in this theoretical universe in your brain, you can always be the person that's working on the book, or I'm writing a novel, or I'm going to write a memoir, or I've been thinking about my business for the last 3 years. And that's not good. You got to move from theory to action. And when everything is nebulous and an idea and I'm working on it and I'm in the draft process and when you have this, you're not actually in the arena. You're not putting yourself out there. You're not saying, hey, done this. This is my thing. What do you think? Was this valuable to you? Because now you're going to get real feedback. Now you're going to get real data. Now the market, if you will, is going to review your book, and people are going to read it, and they're going to tell you whether they like it, or they're going to, and now all of a sudden there's an emotional stakes there. And so that's often why people don't move on to the next stage. It's not because the action of doing it is difficult. It's in your own mind. So that's why I wanted to talk about this a while. So I understand that we need to talk about exactly how to write a memoir. So I'm doing it. Okay, guys, I'm going to talk about how to write a memoir. But firstly, you need to just get over your own brain. Okay. So you start with a lesson from your life, right? And this goes for every book. Okay. This is if you're writing a science fiction, a romance, or whatever, it doesn't matter. But my idea here is that this is plot and structure, right? So you get the basics of what's happening. What's the basics of what's happening? Okay. And then once you have the basics of what's happening, what are the characters involved? What's the lesson? Anyways, you get the idea. So this is what I want to teach. This is the lesson. This is a big idea. Just make a call. If you want to write 5 of them, write 5 of them. Who cares? Just get in the arena. Okay. Then structure and plot. We have apps for that, and then chapter by chapter. And now you know exactly what you're going to write in chapter by chapter. Now, if you are a literary writer and you have a very particular voice and you want to add things to it, then that's fine. And you can work on it for another 6 months, but at least you have a 200-page document that you can start editing. Does that make sense? Okay, so this applies to every book. And so now how do you apply this to your memoir? There's a few things that are different. And I think that this is really important when you're thinking about your memoir. So the first thing is the lesson, okay? And the lesson has a climax, essentially, right? So you guys know that every book has climax and then a resolution. And the only difference, do you guys know what the difference between a climax and a resolution is? This is kind of interesting. What do you guys think? I don't want to be, oh, wow, Tina, that's really nice. It's helping me move from theory to action. I feel so liberated by it. Patricia, I love Book Daddy. Creative mindset, yeah. Chantel, thanks. Okay, so Reverend Bill says, the climax is an open loop, no resolution yet. Yeah, basically. So the climax is the event that causes the resolution, if you will. Okay, so the resolution essentially is the articulation of the lesson. Okay, so the climax could be the divorce, right? We actually got the divorce. Okay, so it happened. And the whole book was, should I get a divorce? Should I not? And then the end is, okay, we got a divorce, right? The end of a science fiction novel could be they destroyed the world and killed the bad guy. So it's the big fight at the end, and the hero wins, right? There's something that happens, okay? So because that happens, what is that saying about the nature of reality? What is that saying philosophically about the world, right? That is the resolution, which is essentially a articulation of the lesson, okay? Does this make sense? Some people even do this in an epilogue. They don't even put it in the actual chapter, but I recommend putting it in the actual chapter. But you can even have an epilogue. Oh, by the way, this is what was actually happening. Does that make sense? Yeah, video editor. This is the most dramatic. This is the big fight scene, essentially, right? And the fight scene could be them fighting with their own demons. The fight scene could be them arguing with their therapist. The fight scene could be them forgiving someone. It could be positive. It doesn't have to be negative. It could be they finally forgive their father for the trauma that happened when they were young. That's the climax. And so then because they forgave their father, think about this is super emotional. And maybe the father's dead. So it's not even a physical act. It could be they go into their room and they, I don't know, read a journal entry from their father, and it says something about regret and that he was human just like him, essentially. And then that's the climax. The climax is finding the journal of your dead father and then being able to forgive them. Okay. Or it could be Avengers Endgame and there's different universes and superheroes are killing each other. It could be that intense, or it could be an internal climax. It doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, there's a climax that's happening. And then because that happened, what are you as an author making a claim about reality? Usually this is some kind of should statement. Not to get spiritual, but one of the problems of the materialists or atheists, essentially, in the Enlightenment, like what happened in the Enlightenment is, this is, you guys know Nietzsche would say, he's famously said, God is dead, right? Well, people don't really understand what that is because Nietzsche's hard to read and people don't really read him. But what he was saying was essentially that as we start thinking in our brains and not just believing in faith in God, and this was also because of the printing press, and people, ironically, they started to educate themselves. And so we were like, oh, the world is not flat, and this is how astronomy works, and this is what math is, and this is, people started to educate themselves. And so the Enlightenment happened. And people thought to themselves, well, then I don't really need God, and because I can think my way through, right? And I'm not trying to have a spiritual lesson here because I don't even know what I necessarily believe, full transparency. But this is nonetheless something that happened. And what Nietzsche said was, well, if we don't believe in a higher power, then the should statement in philosophy, remember he was a philosopher. And if you're a writer, you're essentially a philosopher, just to be clear. Okay. You're a philosopher, you're a psychologist, you're a thinker, right? Even if you're telling a fun story, even if all you do is easy page turner, young adult fiction romances, right? That's like Colleen Hoover or something. Although ironically, some of her books are pretty intense. But even if you're writing a kind of a typical structured story and your goal is to just entertain people, even if that's your goal, the ability to have the pattern recognition to even understand what a hero's journey is and what are different scenes that are necessary in order for someone to go from where they were to where they essentially want to be, and all of the conflict associated with that is really philosophically intense and psychologically intense. And you have to understand anthropology of like how societies and settings are structured and families, and writing is not just a casual thing to do, right? So you guys are all, I'm sure, deep thinkers to an extent, right? You're always asking these big idea questions. And so back to this Nietzsche idea is that in philosophy, there's different schools, right? So the questions of philosophy are epistemology. I'm sure I'm spelling this wrong. Is what is, so basically, right? Like, what do we know, right? What do we know, right? And then some people will categorize it as metaphysics as well, which is essentially what is, okay? But then there's ethics, and you guys know that, right? And ethics is what should we do? Okay. And then there's often aesthetics, which is something like what is beauty, right? These are sort of the four major categories of philosophy. I promise I have a point here. What the problem is with a materialist or a physicist or a biologist or someone that's in the science world, that's this ethics question, what should we do, is difficult to answer. If you ask why, it's like, well, why should we not do this? Or why should we do this? What is right? What is wrong? Should we forgive? Should we not forgive? Is murder right? Is murder wrong? Well, it depends on the context, but when is the context, right? This is the nature of our justice system. These are deep questions. And essentially what writers do, and when you're telling stories, is you're kind of subtly answering these questions. That's what a lesson is. A lesson is essentially, you should do this, or people should do this and not do that. That's what a lesson is, right? And so when he said God is dead, he said, if God is, essentially what he's saying is, if God is dead, we're going to have a really hard time with ethics, because now sort of anything's up for grabs. If there's no God, if there's no hell, if there's no heaven, then who cares? We'll just do whatever we want. My ethics is whatever feels good for me, right? And who's going to tell me that I'm wrong, right? So that's what he was actually talking about, which he ended up being sort of right with Germany. But my big idea, again, I'm sorry to get off. I'm not trying to get off topic here. My point here is that there is a lesson, which is a should statement, okay? Which essentially you're making an argument as to what is right and what is wrong, okay? And you're going to articulate it in your resolution. You're making an argument, but instead of making your argument philosophically, you're making your argument in allegory, essentially, or storytelling, which is more powerful because that's what people remember, right? So you reverse engineer from you have this lesson, and what you guys know in your memoir is, what's the lesson that I want to teach? What's the big idea that I want to teach relative to the climactic event, the big event that happened that taught me that lesson? Terry, does that make sense? So just think about that. If I, again, and reduce Pomodoro technique, reduce the stakes in the next 30 seconds, you have to write down in a couple sentences, what is the big lesson of my life, and what was the event? What is the thing that happened that really solidified and caused me to believe that that was true? Was it something that happened in my childhood? Was it something that happened in my adulthood? Was it something that happened last year? Was it something that kept on happening over and over again, but then there was an event that, oh, yes, now I know, right? If you can have that lesson with that climax, you now have the seed to a memoir. Everything is reverse engineered from that climax and that lesson. So what am I going to write about? I don't know. What am I going to write about? That's what you're writing about, okay? So everything else is kind of easy from there. So you're going to have this climactic scene, which could be multiple chapters, but essentially it's whatever the big thing that happened. Then afterwards, you're going to have a chapter or two that's going to resolve it and essentially articulate more on the nose. You guys know what on the nose means? It just means being explicit, essentially. You're going to explicitly explain what the lesson is. This is what I learned, right? This could be you won the race or something. It doesn't matter. And then now that you have that, you have the ending. Okay, cool. Now you reverse engineer from the ending. Okay. And you say, what is the opening? Okay. But you don't start with the opening because you don't know what the opening is. What do you know? You know the inciting incident. You guys still following along? Does this make sense? I haven't seen anything in the chat. Yeah. Okay. All right. So what you do know is there's you guys know what an inciting incident is? Yeah. So the inciting incident is a thing that caused them to usually go into the new world, right? There's current world, current belief. You guys know the hero's journey, right? Current belief. Maybe you don't. So there's this current world, current belief. There's the protagonist, which is you in this case. And the current belief is the opposite of the lesson, right? So you didn't have this lesson, okay? And so you draw it back and you say, okay, where was I before I believed in this, before I had this realization? What was my life like? What was the world like? Well, the protagonist is you. Why did I believe that, right? Why did I believe that? And then what happened that set off the chain of events to lead to the climax? And usually it has to do with some goal. Okay. I wanted this. It could be emotional. I wanted to feel good. I wanted to make money. I wanted to move. I wanted to make my parents proud. I wanted to be a good parent. I wanted, whatever it may be, right? I wanted to do this thing. And then I did a bunch of things that were probably bad, and not bad, unethical, but just that weren't right, essentially. And then eventually I learned this big lesson. Okay. So what was the thing that set off the chain of events, okay, that led you to this lesson? Okay, cool. So you start with this. You have one big scene. Cool. Then you have your resolution. Cool. Then you reverse engineer to the inciting incident, which is not the opening, right? Why is the inciting incident not the opening? I'll give you the most famous, well, whatever. That doesn't mean anything. One of the best-selling memoirs of the last 20 years. The only reason why I say that is because famous is relative to culture and where you're from and all this sort of thing. But you guys know Eat, Pray, Love? You know that book, Elizabeth Gilbert? Yeah. She's really interesting right now. She shaved her head and she's becoming kind of a Buddhist. But Elizabeth Gilbert, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love. Spoiler alert, the story is essentially her being in New York, the kind of Sex and the City life, not really enjoying herself, then going to Italy, and then going to India, and then I think Bali, Indonesia, or something like that. And it's the story Eat in Italy, Pray, which, guys, you should really come to next. This is what I'm talking about, setting and world building, because think about Eat, Pray, Love is essentially just saying where she went. The setting is a character in that book. But anyways, that's more advanced. We'll talk about that next week. The opening, does anyone remember the opening of that book? The opening of the book is not the inciting incident. This is a memoir, by the way. Eat, Pray, Love is a memoir. It doesn't talk about her childhood really that much. It doesn't talk about everything that happened in her life. It doesn't. It's just a few things that happen. Right. And the big idea, the big lesson for her is that money in the sort of American rat race is not fulfilling. That's her argument in that book. The lesson is I had a lot of money. I was in New York City. I had the Sex and the City life, and everyone thought that I should be happy, and I wasn't happy. And so then I realized I needed to be true to who I am and go on an adventure. And the American money rat race is not all what it's cracked up to be. That's essentially her lesson. Does that make sense? So and then it's the 3-act structure is very clear. It's every country, right? Eat, pray, love. So the opening of this is actually her eating dinner with a guy from Italy who she's kind of not in love with, but in lust with. And he's this kind of suave, beautiful Italian man. And she wants him to kiss her. And it's her kind of fantasizing about him kissing her. And that's the opening. So you're starting in the action. So this is interesting. There's some tension there. There's a desire. there's a protagonist that wants something. So this is the fractal of storytelling, is that every single chapter and every single scene has its own hero's journey. That's, again, it's a little bit more advanced, but the idea is that there's a hero's journey within that opening scene. Here she is. What's the antagonist? The antagonist is this guy and the setting, essentially not kissing her, which is the tension, and her wanting him to. But then you're opening up a bunch of questions, which is like, why is she there, and who is this guy, and why is he not kissing her, and there's all these kind of open-ended questions, which makes you keep reading, right? But the inciting incident of the story is her leaving her husband and leaving her job in New York City. That's the inciting incident. But she doesn't start. That's chapter 2 or chapter 3. Does this make sense? Is this clear? So again, I'm going to keep repeating myself. Step 1, lesson, climax. Step 2, resolution. Step 3, inciting incident. Then you can write an opening, but you're probably going to have to rewrite it. It's, for me, I can't write the middle without the opening, but just know that you're going to edit the opening, probably more than anything. So you can write the opening after the inciting incident just to kind of get the ball rolling and feel the vibes of have an opening. But if you're going to edit anything multiple times, you're going to edit the climax scene and you're going to edit the opening probably 5 or 6 times, to be honest. So just be aware that the opening is going to be redone. Okay. So now look, you have an opening, or at least a placeholder, and then you have an inciting incident that you know where you're going, which is going to lead to the climax, okay? And then you're going to have resolution, okay? So now 90% of the work, right? So now what do you have, essentially, right? You have the structure and the plot. So now you have your lesson, and now you're moved on to number 2, and you have your structure and your plot. So now you need to turn this into chapter by chapter, okay? Which at this point, you probably have 4 to 6 chapters already, so you essentially need like 10 in between chapters, okay? And the way to... what are the mini lessons, okay, or the mini trials that happened along the way? Okay, so think about, not back to the philosophy idea, is that if you're making an argument, you usually have premises. I don't know if you guys remember from high school or university, where you're making an argument. You say, this is my belief. I believe that everyone should use an iPhone. Well, why do you think everyone should use an iPhone? Well, let me give you my premises. My premises are that you should have a phone that helps you with business. So you should have a phone that has a good battery life. You should have a phone that is environmentally conscious. And you're going to make a series of premises, and therefore my belief is that everyone should have an iPhone. Okay, this is a stupid example, but you get the idea. There's essentially a series of arguments that are going to lead to your lesson. And so another way to ask this question is, like, how do you know that this is true? This big idea, this thesis. How do you know this is true? Well, I know it's true. Just talk it out. I believe that if you're in a bad marriage, it's worthy, and you owe it to yourself and your family and your life to get a divorce. Right? This is kind of controversial, right? So I'm just using that because it's in front of my face. But let's say that's the point of your memoir, just as an example. Well, why is that true? Well, okay, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and I didn't believe it, but then this happened, and then this happened, and so then it all kind of built up. The ingredients of your built up, and then eventually you had this realization. And so whatever those mini lessons are, whatever those mini trials are, those mini realizations, right? Then just brainstorm, and those are chapters, okay? And then put them chronological, okay? And then you have, essentially now you have your chapter by chapter outline, okay? Does this make sense? Lisa asks, I get stuck trying to figure out how to start. Yeah, don't start with start. I know that'd be a funny nonfiction title. Don't start with start. Can your climax for a memoir be? Yeah, and don't even start at the end, honestly. The climax is near the end, but it's not the actual end. Can your climax for a memoir be a revelation for you realize for your? Yeah, of course. That's the only way, really. This is what I mean, Lisa, is that you have the big lesson where you realized it, but it was caused by a series of smaller experiences. And so what was that? The moment, the climax could be, I'm sitting by the river and thinking to myself, and I see the glint of the sun, and it makes me realize whatever I realized. The climax doesn't have to be, again, you're not necessarily writing an opera. It doesn't have to be that dramatic. It could be just you at home and thinking to yourself. And in that moment, you had the realization. I had an aha moment. Oh my God. I looked at this painting at the museum and I realized and that's the climax. It's okay. But it's only a climax if you said you've showed leading up to that, all of the mini experiences that led to that. Martha says, can you start the story with a life-changing event and then go, yeah, okay. So Martha, that's more advanced. Yes, you can. You're reversing it essentially. But if you're going to do that, the realization or the event, usually, every great writer in the history of the world has broken rules. It's fine. If you're super advanced, you can do whatever you want. If it's good, it's good. But if you're going to start with the climax, usually it has to be super intense and the stakes have to be pretty high. It has to be kind of shocking. And then you are writing it like a crime thriller, meaning that a crime thriller is not what happened. It's who did it or how did it happen. Does this make sense? So the crime buries the lead, right? So it's not, is someone going to die? They die. The inciting incident of crime is someone dies, right? That in that genre. And so if the inciting incident is here's the climax, that's fine. But then you have to understand that now the question that you're answering for the reader, if they're going to continue, is how did that happen? So you have to leave it a bit mysterious, right? Does that make sense, Martha? Tess. So if you don't start with the start, we need to start with the climax. Be careful, Tess. Just be careful with this idea of need. Again, I'm giving you, I wish that there was just one perfect right answer. I'm giving you general structures, right? To kind of get you to the next level. But then once you have the clay, you can start messing with it and do what you want with it. You got to make it your own. Right. So Lisa says there's a quote, if you want to find your purpose in life, find your wound. Yeah, absolutely. If you read great memoirs or stories of great people, essentially it's just a series of failures. This happened and I failed. This happened and I failed. This happened and I failed. But from those failures, we learn. Right. And so and people love, let me give you a thought experiment. Okay. So there's two people. One person is, you're at a wedding. Okay. You're at a wedding and one person comes up to you and says, hey, Tess, I'm a really good dancer. I'm a really good dancer. Okay. So I'm going to go dance. And then they go dance and they're really good. Damn, this person's really good at dancing. They were right. They said they were good and they're really good. That's cool. Or someone comes up to you and they say, I'm really nervous. I've never danced before. I'm shy. I'm an introvert. I think everyone's going to judge me. I'm really scared. And I think I'm going to try to dance anyways. And then they dance and they're really bad because they're bad. Who do you have more respect for? Does this make sense? Who do you respect more? For me, I respect the person that was bad, objectively bad, because it doesn't matter. Who cares? I'm bad at almost everything. I'm bad at making coffee cups. I'm bad at making microphones. I'm bad at, you have a specialization. I happen to be good at writing and teaching around books, but almost everything else I'm pretty bad at. I'm decent at running. I think I'm a decent husband, but I'm really bad at soccer, right? So that's fine. Welcome to being human. You're bad at a lot of stuff. Who cares? It doesn't matter. But for whatever reason, people think that they have to be perfect at everything and then they get insecure and whatever. So my point is that the person that is scared, you actually respect a lot. And so this is what in Memoir, I'll get to a couple little quick lessons and I'll put it out to Terry, is you got to tell the truth, guys. Okay? You have to be vulnerable. The whole point of Memoir is be vulnerable. The more vulnerable you are, the more you talk about your pain, the more you talk about your wounds, as someone said, right? Then the more they respect you, right? Vulnerability is power. This is Brene Brown. You guys ever read Elite? Brene Brown. She talks about this. She's a coach to some of the biggest executives in the world, and her higher life work is vulnerability is power. So you have to tell the truth in a memoir. You have to share the secrets, right? A lot of times people say you have to write like your parents are dead. I know that that's kind of an extreme way of saying it, but people are worried that there's this one person or their parents are going to judge them, or if I'm honest, or now you got to go down the rabbit hole and you got to open it up. Okay. Oftentimes memoirs are sad and they have really intense stuff. So you might want to throw in a little bit of humor there every so often. David Sedaris is probably the best at this. His entire bibliography is essentially really dark things that happen, but he tells them in really funny ways. So bring in some funny as you can. It's hard to just read sadness the whole time. Open with drama, open with action. Think like a fiction writer. So have a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter if you can. Write for the reader. Think about, again, it's fine. Memoir is not a journal. Just be careful with this. That's my essential point, is that if you're writing the memoir for yourself and it's a journal and you're going to publish the journal and it's for your family, sure, go ahead. But if you really want something that is impactful, think about it from the reader's perspective. Are they going to enjoy this? Because this happened to me in my life is not that interesting if you don't write it for the reader, right? And then, like I said, write the opening last. And this doesn't mean that you write the opening last. You write the opening usually fourth, but write the final opening last once you have the book finished, because then you'll be able to open more effectively.